very few times I've seen my husband cry, but every single time I have, I'm like, okay, if he only knew how much more I love him when he does those things, he'd probably be crying all the time. Tony and Alisa are here. These are two people who have two children, and they've had a successful podcast devoted to helping couples restore their connection, to have better relationships. They've been doing that for over 12 years. They've helped hundreds of thousands of people understand what it takes, because it is a skill. Improving your relationship, whether you're married or not, is in fact a skill. And I'm really delighted to have them here today. So Tony and Alisa, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having us.
We're excited.
I am too. You know, I know we have a lot in common. We're both Californians, both been married for a long time, both have older son, younger daughter, and both really devoted to helping people understand that this isn't something you get a manual for. This isn't something that everyone was even necessarily role modeled.
Right.
But there's so much possibility there. It's like a skill. It's like anything else. You can improve it. And the other reason why I wanted to have you on, and it was really important to have experts in this area, is because I've done a few episodes recently. I did one on emotional intimacy and I did one on sexual intimacy. And the feedback I got, the constructive criticism I got on the emotional intimacy episode was that while they kind of understood what it looked like, they didn't understand, like, how do we do it?
Right.
I don't know how. And so I'd love to talk about that. And I thought one of the best places we could start, if you're okay with it, is why, when we say intimacy, do we struggle with what that really means?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and that's one we've heard for so long. And most of the time when people say intimacy, male, female, husband, wife, the thing that goes off in their brain is sex.
Yeah.
It's the first thing. And it's like, I've had conversations, Elisa's had conversations, and we talk to people and they're like, well, we want better intimacy. And the only thing they're thinking about is sexual intimacy. And yet there's emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, spiritual intimacy. And so what we share with couples all the time is like, you can't be having sex 24/7. You just can't. So you have to dive into, especially what you said, your emotional intimacy. You have to engage one another, that connection you guys have with one another, so you can experience the sexual intimacy.
Do you find that couples who read a book like yours, so by the way, we're going to talk about this book, The 6 Pillars of Intimacy.
Yeah.
But what I like is that there's so many different layers to and different types of intimacy. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, but I'm curious, who reads a book like this? Is it someone who already has a great marriage, or is it someone who realizes that there are cracks in the foundation?
Both. Yeah, there are a lot of couples.
Do you find that I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm so bad at that. But do you find that there's usually one partner who's like more interested in doing the work?
Well, there's usually one partner that will go after a book, right? Or after a podcast.
Yeah.
And then they introduce it to their spouse. But we do have those folks, in the one family, that's what we call our audience, who are definitely, they're like, we've got a good marriage, but what would it look like to have a great marriage? And then you have those people who are like, there's a disconnect going on here. We don't know what it is. We need help. And they will get their hands on a book like The 6 Pillars, and they'll see that the framework is so easily laid out that now they have words to the disconnect. Now they have we call them cracks in the pillars. They have words to that. And once somebody has a name to what's going on in their relationship, they're actually empowered to go do something about it. And that's why The 6 Pillars has been a framework that so many couples and individuals have been able to adopt in their marriage.
That transcends so many topics. I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking about the feedback that we got after doing the episode about just women's sexual reproduction, and how so many of us have been afraid to use certain words, and we've been using the wrong words to describe our vulva, to describe different parts of our bodies, and how many women said that, gosh, I feel, first of all, a lot more comfortable and more empowered knowing the right words. So it's so interesting to think that this is also true of our relationships. I polled my audience today, and I told them I'd be speaking to you, and I said, what do you believe is your number one challenge if we're talking about just one of the pillars? And again, there's 6 that are covered in detail in your book. But if we're just talking about the emotional intimacy, what do you think is your greatest challenge or obstacle? And I'm hoping I can share that with you, and you might be able to help us break it down.
Let's do it.
Let's go.
Overwhelmingly, they said, I just don't even know how to talk about or be comfortable talking about what it is I need, or to even know how to describe what it is I need on an emotionally intimate level.
And it's not surprising to hear that from your audience, because I think if you asked 10 people on the street, you'd probably hear the same responses from all 10. Most of us didn't grow up with somebody saying, here's how you be emotionally intimate with someone, and getting that blueprint, right? We had our parents as role models. We had friendships, other dating relationships besides our marriage. And so we have all these places where it's been trial and error. And sometimes we have a whole lot more error than success.
And can I share, I was actually up with my mom just this past week. And it was funny, we were talking about this very thing, about emotional intimacy. My dad passed away about 4.5 years ago. And so we get into these interesting conversations of what I saw growing up with mom and dad, and especially with what Alisa and I do now. And my mom goes to me, she goes, well, your dad and I were really good. We would talk. And I'm like, yeah, Mom, you guys weren't the greatest role models. You were great. You loved one another. I mean, they were married 46 years before Dad died. I go, but you weren't the role model that allowed me to get to where I am today in my marriage. Alisa and I had to go after it. We had to be intentional. We had to take action. We had to learn these new skills on how to communicate both verbally and non-verbally so that we could have the extraordinary marriage we desire. And she just sort of looked at me and she's like, oh, wow. She's like, you didn't learn that much from us, did you? And I'm like, I learned some, but not a lot.
And is that, would you say, where most of us have picked up our skills or lack thereof, is from what was role modeled to us in terms of emotional intimacy?
I would say yes, because it's the most intense relationship we have outside of our marriage, right? It's day in and day out. You're watching your parents, how do they do conflict, right? How do they fight? How do they speak encouraging words over one another or not, right? I talk to so many coaching clients who are like, I never saw my parents fight. Like, I don't know what that looks like. And now when we're in conflict in our marriage, I don't know how to. I literally just spoke to a wife a couple hours ago, and she's like, I struggle with asking my husband what it is that I need. Right? Exactly what your audience is saying. And so, from a very practical standpoint, as I told this wife, I said, he doesn't have ESP.
Nope.
If you don't tell him, I need, 10 minutes of your time just to sit down and talk about something that's not related to the kids or your job, he's not going to automatically figure it out just because you're thinking it in your head. We've been married 25 years. Tony still doesn't get that kind of stuff.
Well, sure. Yeah, we're different.
Yeah.
If that is the most powerful place where we're learning these cues, is it possible then to have been raised in a family where there wasn't any emotional intimacy between siblings, between family members, between your parents? Is it possible? How do you learn it then outside of that environment? And is it possible to see what it is you don't want?
Yeah, it is. There are a lot of families that there's little emotional intimacy, whether it's, issues that the parents themselves are dealing with, or they never saw it role modeled. And so it becomes this generational thing where, you'll hear, oh, well, our family just doesn't talk about things.
Yeah.
I hear that from a lot of people. And you said it earlier, Chalene, and I think it's so important. Any relationship skill can be developed if there's a willingness to learn.
Willingness to learn. Isn't that the truth? Okay. Speak to that for me.
Well, I'm actually thinking of one couple, and Tony will know who I'm talking about here in just a second, but there's a couple in our audience married 40 plus years. They spent probably the first 35 in a highly dysfunctional, emotionally unavailable marriage. The husband was raised where men didn't show emotions, right? You just put your head down and you take care of your family and you go to work and that's it. And so for years, decades, this couple was just kind of drifting apart, going through the motions. They'd made a decision they weren't going to get divorced, but they weren't exactly happy being married. And so about 2 years ago, they went on a journey to even learn what emotions were. The husband, and you can find these things called emotion wheels. You can find it on Amazon. That gets beyond like the basic emotions, right? People think happy, angry, sad, scared, disgust. And those are the basic ones that we're comfortable showing or knowing. But what does it look like to go deeper and say, what's underneath that? And this couple is so cute. They actually have a dictionary in their bedroom. And so they've made a commitment every day to talk about 2 emotions, one positive emotion and one negative emotion that they're feeling. And he actually will look up words in the dictionary to see, okay, what exactly does that word mean? And does that describe how I'm feeling? And now there are a couple in their 60s who would describe, if you were to ask them today, they would say their marriage is better than it's ever been. And they're emotionally closer in their 60s than they've ever been in their entire marriage.
And this is a couple that is from the South. And so when we say words like penis and vagina, they were like, whoa, but it helped them to understand that, oh, we can use that vocabulary around one another to express where we're at and what we're doing in that area, but also in other areas.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned they've been married for so long. And I think many times people think, well, there's nothing terribly like wrong with our relationship. So maybe we start with, before we get into like many more tips and like the practical, like here's what you can do. Why do I need to do this? What are the benefits? How is this going to help me? If I'm going to put in all this effort, what's possible?
Well, I think, it's hard not to look at, media, news stories, or even just what's happening in your community and not see marriages falling apart, not see couples who are just going through the motions, who would describe their marriage as okay. But the reality is not a single one of us was ever designed to live just an okay life.
That's right.
There is so much potential inside each one of us, and so much potential for our marriage. And I tell coaching clients all the time, like, your marriage getting healthy and becoming extraordinary isn't just for the 2 of you.
That's right.
You're in a community, you might have children. There are coworkers who are looking at the 2 of you saying, what did they figure out? What's their secret? Why are they actually happy 25, 30 years into marriage? Why are they breaking the trends or the negative? And so when you step into this place of going from okay to great, there literally is limitless possibility for how the 2 of you will get along for, 50 years.
And we have one life to live, Chalene, like we do. And if we're going to do this thing called marriage, let's do it at the best. Like, let's go after it. And Alisa and I have been married 25 years, but it wasn't always like that. At 11-year mark, we almost got divorced for the second time. And so we've seen it. We've gone through the ringer. We've gone through the tough times, and we realize, like, this is one life. Like, let's live it. Let's go after it, because the legacy we can leave can just reverberate for generations to come.
And does emotional intimacy, I'm curious if your opinion is that pillar has an impact on the other pillars of intimacy? Because you talk about sexual intimacy, you talk about spiritual intimacy, you talk about financial intimacy, you talk about all these pillars in your book, which I think is really important. But I'm wondering, if this pillar isn't right, is it possible to have the others be strong if your emotional intimacy isn't there?
We've actually referred to it in the book as the workhorse of the pillars. And it's because if you look at any of the other 5, you're having conversations both verbally and non-verbally. And so if your emotional intimacy has got cracks in it, if you're struggling, you'll see that carry over, maybe not in all of them, but you'll see that the other pillars will have cracks in them. And it'll be a challenge for you to maybe discuss finances, because you don't have it's not safe, or doesn't feel like a healthy place to be vulnerable. You'll have trouble, spending time together and doing dates in your recreational intimacy, because you're like, we have nothing to talk about. What do we talk about on a date? And so you see it carry over if this one isn't strong.
Can you define for us how you define emotional intimacy?
Yeah, emotional intimacy, it's really simple. It's the verbal and the nonverbal communication that you have with one another. So it's the words we're speaking to one another, but it's also that nonverbal communication that I think a lot of us tend to sort of like go, oh, that's not impacting my spouse. But when they come in and our arms are crossed and we just look at them, we turn away from them and we don't say anything, that speaks volumes in any situation you may be in with your spouse. And
I was just saying, or maybe you just spend a whole lot more time looking at your phone than you do looking at your spouse. Right. And that really cuts into that emotional intimacy, because it really, intimacy at its most basic is that closeness and connection that's developed in a particular area. And when you think about all of the conversations that you have over the life of a marriage in all of these different areas, you have to be able to speak verbally and non-verbally to your spouse.
The examples you just gave to us were all of those were nonverbal. So give me some examples of verbal communication where you're missing the mark.
Well, a lot of it, your tone of voice, right? So when we get into, what does that look like to be dismissive or to be abrupt, or even maybe you're the one that's interrupting all the time, because you've got to get your thought out, or you don't want the conversation to end without having the last word. Those are different ways that the verbal communication, if it's got cracks in it, you aren't actually listening to your spouse. You aren't creating space where it's safe.
Yeah. And I would say here's something that I had to do many, many years ago. I had an addiction to pornography. Prior to meeting Alisa, it came into our marriage. Thank God I've been porn free now for 18 years.
Thank you for your transparency, by the way.
Oh yeah, for sure. But by viewing porn, it impacted Alisa's self-confidence drastically, because what I was viewing wasn't her, and she knew that.
Or
And
real.
so, yeah, I mean, it's fake, right? It's
Yeah, right.
absolutely fake. And so one of the things I had to do and learn from myself, because I'm a work in progress, and I had to get the skills, and I had to be able to build her up. So in my emotional intimacy, I just remember going, all right, I'm going to call Lisa my beautiful wife, Alisa. That is the way I'm going to speak about her. That's the way I'm going to introduce her. It's the way I've been introducing her on the podcast for 12 years or 10 years with the new opening that we put on. And so I always say that if we're out somewhere, I'm just like, this is my beautiful wife, Alisa. That's a way to communicate your love and respect, and to honor your spouse in a way that you think is like, oh, how do I get deep? Well, I just had to keep telling her that. And in the beginning, she didn't hear it. She'd be like, no, I'm not, or say something else and brush me off. And I would just keep telling her, I'm like, no, you're my beautiful wife, Alisa. And 25 years later, I think she's more beautiful now than the day we got married in October of 96.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a perfect example. Alisa, what would be an example that you personally would say you had to change because it, from a verbal communication standpoint?
So, and full disclosure, before I say this, my parents know that I talk about my upbringing on our show and when I'm interviewed. So nobody get freaked out that I'm throwing my parents under the bus.
Mom and dad know it. They're cool.
I grew up in a family where, sharp words or very, abrupt statements were the norm. And so I had to really learn how to be mindful of my tone of voice. What does that look like for me? Not to just try and cut Tony down, but to actually be like, I'm experiencing something inside of me and I need to tell you what I'm feeling. I need to put words to that so that you can actually hear me and not hear my biting tone of voice. I could be very dismissive. I could be very short and just like, well, I'm not listening to you. And he was like, I'm your husband. We need to talk. Like, we actually need to, like, you need to engage with me.
We have to engage. And I grew up in an Italian family, so everybody would scream at each other, but everybody was okay with that. And you'd all just walk away, hug each other, give each other kisses, and we'd move on. But when she would do it, it wasn't that we could come back to each other and just be like, all right, cool. I love you. It really stung. And there would be division and how do we get back to, okay, let's address the problem and attack that problem.
Yeah, for me, tone of voice has always been, I won't say always, but tone of voice was an area that I really needed to work on, because when it comes to, it's not just what you say, which is really something to be mindful of as you're building emotional intelligence, but how are you saying it? Because a lot of times, like we just did an episode on name calling, a recent episode that we did. And, in that we had pulled our audience and shared a lot of very, very hurtful words that they have said to one another. And even as I was speaking those words out loud, Chalene, on the show, like I felt the visceral reaction to just speaking those words out loud. And it's something that we all have to be mindful of, just the power of your words.
Yeah. I mean, we've never name called. I can't imagine how that would feel. I cannot imagine. But it also was raised in a family where there wasn't, like, my parents never name called. Like, I hear so many people in my audience will say that, the things that their parents said maybe in sarcasm, maybe in anger, whatever, but just a lot of name calling. And I have to assume that that gets carried over into our marriages and our relationships. Okay, so if I'm, again, there's that block for communication for the person who's listening right now who maybe doesn't even know how to tell their spouse, when you yell or when you raise your voice, it makes me feel this way. How do we start this conversation so it doesn't feel like we're pointing fingers, but also that we can figure out, number one, what do they need from us? And how do I tell them? Let's just start with tone. How do I tell them in this particular situation, here's the tone that I need?
Well, and I'm even going to take it back one step further. A lot of times when couples have these conversations, there's been all of this communication theory over the years that says you need to sit down just kind of like we are right now. You need to be across the table from one another, and I need to be staring into your eyes. We need to have this conversation.
You need to be knee to knee, holding hands, and we're going to have this conversation.
And that just feels uncomfortable to a lot of people.
Good. I'm glad, because I think it just seems unrealistic. It seems like something you see on a TV show or in a movie,
but it's
not real.
It's not real. Exactly.
And Alisa and I were taught that and heard that early on, and it scared the living bejeebies out of me. Like having to sit there and look her in her eyes and like, oh my gosh, here we go. It was tough, and it caused me not to want to have those conversations. So I would be avoiding Alisa in those moments.
Okay.
So what I want to say to that is, what a lot of couples need to do is they actually need to get out of their house, right? And get moving. When our bodies are in motion, and I tell this not just for couples, but also, if you have children that you're trying to get a conversation with, being side by side and in motion, going for a walk, going for a drive, can actually lower a lot of that emotional energy, because you're not face to face. It's not confrontational. We're on the same team, we're side by side. And if you're walking or doing something physical, then you're releasing a lot of that emotional energy or physical energy at the same time you're dealing with emotional situations.
And so we've called those our walk and talks. Alisa and I, we go on walk and talks, and we live here in San Diego, and our beautiful coastline, because you're just north of us. But we just head out to Del Mar, Torrey Pines. We get on the beach, hold hands, and we go on our walk and talks, and we just start to talk, and we just start to share and what's going on, and we hear the waves crashing. And so we have had so many people in the one family do it, no matter where they're at. Just get out in their neighborhood. Get around a lake, get to a park, just get side by side, shoulder to shoulder. Because one of the things that we believe is that you guys can learn these skills when you're on the same team. Right. When you get on that same team, instead of that tone and trying to battle one another, what happens when you're shoulder to shoulder and you go, you know what, we're doing this together. Yeah. So what are we going to do? And sometimes you're going to have a reluctant spouse. I get it. But you know what? That reluctant spouse can come alongside, because they're like, we're not sitting knee to knee. We're getting outside. We're moving. All right, let's go. Or we're going for a drive. All right, let's go. I'm going to take you to this cool place. And then it just gets that moving.
Yeah.
I love that. We just started a Patreon, and there's a level of the Patreon where it's just Brett and I talking, and we record it on our walks. And not until you just said that, I realized that's where I have become more intimately connected to my kids on our long walks with my husband. And for me personally, I'd love to get your take on this. I love it when we can low key these conversations. There's nothing more anxiety producing than someone saying, we need to talk.
Oh yeah.
Like you bet we do. I'm going to get my notes ready. Right. But I think that automatically puts people on the defensive. Like I don't care who I get that message from. When I get that message, I'm like, oh geez, I'm already on the defensive. It could be an employee. It could be a boss. It could be my family member, but it just makes it feel like I've got some issues. You're going to the principal's office and you're in trouble. So I think I'm wondering what your take is on this. Do you suggest that it's a very casual, ease into it kind of thing? Or should it be like, let's set a date on the calendar to talk about us?
Marriages need both.
Mm.
Because if it all of a sudden becomes every time we schedule a walk that we're going to have a talk, then you'll find, just like sitting down across from each other, you're going to be like, I don't want to.
Yeah.
But if couples can start to work this into the fabric of their marriage, maybe it's once a week, they just go for a walk. It's half an hour. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. But if you find that you can regularly talk about yourselves, the good and the challenges, then you don't have to, there isn't such a buildup of we're not talking about things, we're not talking about things, we're not talking about things. And then this volcano happens and I'm throwing everything and the kitchen sink at you, right? So couples that will build in regular time to talk will actually find that over a period of time, they won't have those explosive conversations or those confrontational conversations. Because, if we're just talking one topic, we can just handle that in a walk.
How do we move people from talking about surface level things like the operations of our relationship, like who's going to pick up the kids or who's going to take out the trash or how was your day? How do we move from those operational conversations into things that are more intimate? And what are those things even?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been podcasting for 12 years
Mhm.
on the One Extraordinary Marriage Show. And what we found, many a couples, because they haven't had the training from their parents
Mhm.
or other folks, what they've been able to do is they can listen to Alisa and I, and that is the starter.
Mhm.
That's the jumping point for them,
Right.
because now it's like name calling, for instance. They can listen to it at whatever time they want, but now they're going to go on their walk and talk, and that comes up. They're like, oh, you know what? When Tony said this or Alisa said that,
Right.
how did that make you feel? And so we have such an array of topics and conversations, and it just allows them to just go, okay, we don't need to talk about the surface stuff. We don't need to talk about the kids, laundry, or work. Hey, the podcast this week was on name calling. Let's just take a few minutes and just talk about it. What has it done to us? How's it impacted you? How's it impacted me? Okay, cool. Wow, that was interesting. And then they can move on and talk about the other stuff. But it's that little bit for them to just go, oh, okay, Tony and Lisa can talk about it, then we sure can talk about it.
Mhm.
And we
What
just
do we
want to come
do-
alongside them, and we just want to come alongside them and be their marriage mentors.
I think that's amazing. And I love that you just called it a marriage mentor. I've always said, when people say, who's your mentor? I'm like, well, there isn't one. I have a mentor. And you should have a marriage mentor. You should have a faith mentor. You should have a business mentor. You should have mentors in all these areas. And if you think you found one person who can be a mentor in all those areas, you're probably in a cult, right?
That pretty much sums it up. Yeah.
Right. But so what do we do though for that person who they want to have these conversations and they're in a relationship with someone who was role modeled? We don't talk about our feelings. We don't talk about personal things. We don't talk at all. And they're so uncomfortable with it that you just feel like you're pulling teeth on and making your partner really uncomfortable. How do we help that partner?
Well, a lot of it is, evaluating what are the resources that a couple has at their fingertips. And
Okay.
we often talk about, what are the tools in your toolbox?
Yep.
So for that couple, it might be one of those things where it's like, we're just going to get a box of communication starters from Amazon. I mean, we just went to Las Vegas this past weekend. We hopped in the car. We had 10 hours drive time in the car, and I picked up a box of cards, and I'm like, let's just answer. I think we answered maybe a handful of them. But the conversations and just some of it was past stuff, like from our wedding day all the way up
Wow.
and just these different conversations, because sometimes we just need,
You guys need to create your own.
well,
That's coming off the 6 pillars.
that'll be coming off the 6 pillars of intimacy. It is coming. Thank you. For
Okay,
the
good.
But sometimes it's just, I don't know where to start. I need a tool.
Prompts.
Yeah.
Prompts, exactly. And if so many people get paralyzed thinking they can't. I literally had a husband tell me just a couple hours ago in a coaching session, like, Alisa, he goes, I'm just not a talker. And I said, here's the deal. Everybody can develop communication skills. You don't have to be the one, shouting off the 10,000 words a day or whatever it is they say, but you can learn. Everybody has the ability to learn what it is that my spouse needs and how to respond to them and to stretch. I know a lot of people think, a lot of people listen to the show are probably like, yeah, I'm not a talker. But you can learn how to communicate effectively with your spouse. You can put conversation prompts in your toolkit. You can make time where it's just the two of you and you're going to talk about more than the schedules. You can choose those things. You don't have to identify as I'm not a talker. You can be like, I'm just learning new skills.
What about emotion, like feeling too vulnerable, like you can't cry in front of your partner, or maybe how do we learn that it's okay to have certain emotions? For some people, it's anger, like they were taught to never be angry, especially for women, right? Or maybe for men, they were taught that it's weak to be sad or to cry. How do we learn that our relationship is a safe place and it actually brings us closer together. I don't know about you guys, but like when I very few times I've seen my husband cry, but every single time I have, I'm like, okay, if he only knew how much more I love him when he does those things, he'd probably be crying all the time. You know what I'm saying? Like,
All right,
so
all day
how do we
long.
learn to do that?
Yeah. It's a process, and marriage is a process, and we're on a journey.
Mhm.
And so we can't put a time frame on this either.
Mhm.
And I think that's part of it. In our society today, we say you can, you can't, this and that, and we're expecting you to do it today. And I have learned personally that it is a process. And are you willing to start the process? And I think that's the big thing right now. Are you willing to take that first step?
Mhm.
Because I remember being that way as well. Hey, don't. This is coming from my dad. Guys, don't cry. Hey, don't cry. You know, so I remember being on a job site, stepping on a nail going through my foot. And my dad's like, hey, don't cry. And I'm like,
Don't be human.
I'm like, okay. But it's a process. And are we willing to get there? And I've learned over time, as Alisa and I have done the podcast and have dove in deep in our own emotional intimacy, that because it's a place that we trust one another. We built up the trust. We built up the emotional intimacy that things come and it's okay. It's like, all right, man, I just got to let this out.
But it's, also, and I just want to add to that, if your marriage hasn't developed that safety yet, because I know there are a lot of people like, okay, Tony, I hear you talking about that, but it doesn't feel safe, or I don't feel like
it's true.
In that case, you may actually have to seek the help of a professional.
Yes.
Somebody that can help be that bridge. Like I tell my clients all the time, I said, I'm just a bridge. I'm a bridge between a husband and a wife. Oftentimes I'm a translator saying this is what it sounds like, but it's also that bridge to say, here are the skills that are going to get you to this side of the bridge. And here are the skills you need to come to this side. And here's how we're going to craft safety, because we don't know, everybody's had their own journey to get to a marriage, and we don't know where things have not been safe.
Yeah.
Or where you were told, Tony, it's not okay to cry, or
traumatic instances.
Exactly. And so having a professional that can walk alongside you individually, or the two of you as a couple, to equip, to create safety, to, stop things if they start to get like I've told my clients, I'm like, I'm going to call timeout on you if you start to get a little squirrely on me, right? Because we want to keep this respectful. We want to create that safety. And so having somebody that helps to model that for you and to equip you can actually propel you so much further along than the two of you trying to like bang your head up against a wall going, why can't we figure this out?
I love you mentioned professional help, because I think for so many people, or someone who's listening right now is like, I've created this safe environment. My partner knows that they can show their emotion in front of me. I'm prodding, I'm creating this safe environment, but they are just closed off. And you just keep prodding more and prodding more. But the bottom line is they have some beliefs there that have probably nothing to do with your relationship and everything to do with their childhood. And we can't always assume, in the same way that I can't do Brett's root canal, I also can't always fix his negative beliefs. Like a lot of our relationship 2.0 is the things that I wanted to fix, but I couldn't. Or he wanted to fix them with me, but he couldn't. We had to use the help of a professional therapist and almost reach a breaking point. So my advice would be to couples to not think of therapy as a place where you go as a last resort, but where you go to help improve what's already good.
Well, and if you think about it, we take our cars in, we collectively, every 3,000 to 5,000 miles for an oil change, right? You're not driving your car until the wheels fall off and the engine seizes and it's just a heap of junk. You actually want to maintain it so that your car will last a really long time and take you all the places you need to go. The same thing is true in a marriage. Getting professional help regularly is that maintenance. It's what's going to allow you to, to address things. It's like you go to get your oil change and they say, hey, your air filter needs help. Okay, well, what does that look like for your communication or for your dating? Right? What's the equivalent? Because if we'll take care of our marriage the way we take care of our cars, it's amazing how much further and how much healthier the relationships would be.
Right. I mean, I think about the billions of dollars that are spent every year on things related to our bodies.
Oh,
like
sure.
our physical health and how we look and getting abs and all the things and all the supplements, I mean, people will spend hundreds of dollars on supplements every single month, but it's been 10 years since they bought a marriage book, or maybe they never have. They've
Right.
never bought a book or listened to a podcast
Uh-huh.
on relationships. So that's just crazy to me, because that's where our happiness comes from.
We ask
That's
that
where our
often.
happiness comes from.
We ask that often to our audience. We're like, hey, how much do you invest in your marriage? What are you doing? You want the extraordinary, but what are you doing? Like, are you willing to put in the work? And I'm not saying it's hard work, and I'm not saying marriage is hard. I'm just saying, are you willing to put in the effort to have the extraordinary you desire? Because that's what Alisa and I have done for 12 years. We've gone behind our microphones for half an hour a week and just talked.
Yeah.
And we've
Is it
learned
possible to have a good relationship, a solid relationship, if one party is doing more of the heavy lifting than the other? Like, is it ever going to be balanced? Is that what our goal is?
I don't think the balance is always a funny word to me, because you've got, especially when it comes to marriage, because you've got two people with two totally different personalities. I think the important thing is, are both people making an effort? Right. Yeah. And that will change in different seasons. Right. There have been times when, I've been dealing with my own stuff. And so Tony's had to carry more of that effort load, and vice versa. Ideally you can get to a place, and have those seasons where you both are putting high effort in, but strengthen your marriage to the point where one can carry the other, but you're both are putting forth effort.
You've worked with so many couples. Do you find that there is typically one who has a little bit more emotional intelligence, or maybe they have more tools, had better role modeling, so they tend to take the lead on these things? And do they always take the lead? I mean, I love that you're saying like it should kind of go back and forth, but it nothing ever does, right? Like there's always one person who's going to be the catalyst. Is that to be expected? Because what I don't want is someone to hear this and go, well, it's never been balanced in my relationship, so now I'm going to start to build some resentment because I have these unrealistic expectations.
I was just going to say, the truth of the matter is that I often see in coaching that one person takes the lead, right? They're going to be the person that's going to apply for coaching. They're going to be the one that's going to schedule the sessions, but that's okay as long as the two of you are walking down this road together. Right. If you look at anything, I mean, we are a big football family, right? And so like the quarterback's got to roll. Straight up, the quarterback's got to roll. Our son played defensive line. He was like a nameless, numberless guy on the line. But if he didn't do his role, the team wouldn't have had success.
That's right. Yeah.
And the same thing happens in marriage. There are times when one of you is going to go forward and you're going to be the one that everybody sees, and you're going to be the one making the appointments or doing that kind of thing. But if you're doing it together, it's okay. It's okay that you are the one taking the lead. What's important is that you always come back to, how are we linking arms and building a marriage together, using our different strengths, and understanding that we have different roles in this relationship.
When you work with couples in coaching, do you need both partners? Or do you sometimes just start with one?
I often start with one. Somebody will recognize that things aren't going the way they want it in their marriage. And so they'll just jump into coaching. They'll say, you know what, I know that there are things that I need to work on myself, like some of those resentments or hurts or language or whatever it might be. And so they start working, and I will always invite the other spouse to just join me for a conversation, to give their side of the marriage. And if they're ready to start working with me, that's great. If not, then I'll continue to work with their spouse until they see a change in the dynamic. And then they want to come on board and be a part of that change.
And that's interesting what Alisa just brought up, because one of our big hashtags has always been, what can I do? Because in marriage, we do get that dynamic, which is you're talking about. We want balance and we want our spouse to do this and yet we got to this place, it was like, what can I do?
Yeah.
What can I do? Like, I get your spouses over there and they're having a tough time, and maybe they're having a tough time with work. Maybe it's extended family. Maybe it's something else that you just don't know about. And yet when you look at your marriage, you can just go, what can I do right now? How can I love on them? How can I pour words over them that are going to lift them up and help them through this time? And we've seen so many couples and individuals specifically go, I'm going to take that on. What can I do? And then you start seeing that dynamic change. And it's interesting because it does take a little time for that other person to get on board. But once they get on board, then they're all of a sudden, they're like, oh my gosh,
What are we doing?
let's go. And they're just like, whoa, okay. I've been working on this for 6 months and now you're finally ready.
Mhm,
Can you give us some tips, daily practices even,
mhm,
to get started for that person who is like, I don't even know where to begin. I don't want to freak my partner out.
mhm.
Obviously this audience is heavily female.
Okay.
But we are talking to both people.
Mhm.
Um, Something that is very tangible. You can start doing this tomorrow, or a couple of things where it's not going to freak the other person out. And it's just a good way to get started.
Mhm. What I would say, some of the things we've already mentioned, right? Get out, go for a walk with your
Okay.
spouse,
Love
right?
it.
You can literally open your front door and just go.
Yeah.
You can get conversation cards. And what I would say to that is don't pull out the full box in front of them and be like, because they're gonna freak out. Just be like, hey, I did, and I say this to my coaching clients all the time. I'm like, give them the opportunity to pick the question. Like if you're the one that is wanting your spouse to engage, because if they see you pick a question, they're automatically going to assume literally that you stacked the deck to the question that you want answered, right?
So true. That's something I would do.
Right. And I say it because I'm the same way. So it's like, no, just honey, I bought this. I would love for us to just do one question a week, right? Really low
That's so
key.
easy.
Because now we're not like, oh, we have to have this big heart to heart. And you can even go so far. And I tell my coaching clients, as I said, set a timer for 10 minutes. Honey, we're just going to like have a back and forth over this one question. It's only going to be 10 minutes. Most everybody can find 10 minutes in
Yeah.
168 hours a week to answer a question. And it doesn't feel scary, it doesn't feel intimidating. And the spouse who might be a little more reluctant knows that they just have to hang in there for 10 minutes. It doesn't feel intimidating.
Well, until you release the One Extraordinary Marriage deck of cards for us, which I am excited about, is there one that you would recommend right now on Amazon? Do you know the name of it off the top of your head?
The one that we just picked up was 88 conversation starters for husbands and wives. And I'll make sure that you have that link, that information, and we'll get that to you.
That's amazing. Thank you. So those are two really simple things.
It is.
Those are great. And it's like you can start with that, just doing something physical. What impact do children or maybe a change in life, right? Like, so bring new babies, kids, elderly parents you have to care for, a change in a job, COVID. How do dramatic or traumatic events impact our emotional intimacy? What do we need to be aware of to safeguard that?
Well, we need to be aware of what you and your spouse's tendencies are when you're under stress. Some people will most definitely, they'll retreat. They'll go into that place where, kind of almost that, like, I need to crawl up into the fetal position and I just need to process everything on my own. And then you have some people who under stress can get more animated or agitated. And so when you know how you and your spouse both handle really stressful, traumatic, dramatic situations, you can actually lead with that, right? So I have a tendency to withdraw. And so Tony will actually just be like, I think you need a little space
to process.
He'll straight up tell me, you look like you need a little space to process. And then he lets me go into that space where I can just think through things. But
can I say something about the processor though, too? Because I've had to learn this, and I'm going to give you a real quick tip here. If you are the processor, realize that you still have to go and have the conversation. And so Alisa and I have had to learn this, and I had to tell her
it's
this.
An agreement.
It's
in
like,
marriage.
hey, I know we're having this conversation, and I know I'm giving you a lot of information, and I know you need to process, and I know you're starting to shut down a bit, and that's cool. I'll stop right now. But we're not going to just end it here. We need to make sure that we pick this back up within the next 7 days. Like, we have to close the loop, or we have to address it. It doesn't, early on in our marriage, I just let her go, and then I'd just get furious. I'd get upset. I'd get mad because I was the one who was more emotionally intimate in our younger years of marriage. I was the one who wanted to talk. I come from an Italian family. We talk, we yell, we scream, we put our hands up. It doesn't matter. And Alisa came from a family who heard harsh words and would withdraw. She saw her mom many a times just withdraw herself for hours or days on end. So Alisa would do that, and I would come after her. And then, so we've had to learn that, okay, this still happens at times. but we need to still have the conversation. We
Mhm.
cannot let it die without having some resolve to it.
I'm
Yeah.
glad you said that, because I think it is very common for people who are the communicator and they're going to talk through their processing process.
Right.
When somebody else needs to be silent and alone and withdrawal to process, it
Mhm.
feels like they're shutting you out, and then our brains do the "it must be me." They, and we just go to the worst possible case scenario, and so then you can get really angry. And I know I used to do that with Brett. I used to just prod and prod and prod, and he was just needed to be silent and kind of withdraw when he would process. Now he's better at telling me
Mhm.
that he's processing. Before he would just say nothing's wrong, and then later he would explain that he was processing. Now he'll say, I gotta think this through.
Yeah. They just need a little more time. And us, you and me as talkers, we're like, no, we can just deal with it right now.
We're not going to bed.
Yeah, we're not going to bed.
Let's just
Where do you
go.
think you're going?
Like I tell people, unless you're having sex, there are no great conversations that are going to happen after about 9 o'clock at night, because you both are just so fatigued.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit later now, but yes, I hear
Yeah.
what you're saying. This is true. And what happens to a couple who just is so disconnected on this level emotionally? Does that trickle down into other areas of their lives? I mean, other areas of their relationship?
Mhm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, if you don't have the ability to communicate, if you don't have that emotional intimacy, it becomes really hard to talk about your finances.
Yeah, right.
It becomes really hard to, be able to deal with matters of faith, to be able to spend time together. Because if the two of you aren't talking, then why on earth would I want to go on a date with you? Like, what's that going to look
Yeah.
like?
Yeah.
I don't want to spend time. Like, if we can't talk, I don't want to spend time with you. Right.
Right.
And even getting into the point where, around the sexual intimacy, where if the two of you aren't able to communicate, and, bodies are changing, hormones are changing,
Yeah.
things are happening, but you don't actually have words to be able to use to explain that, you can feel this growing disconnect in your sexual intimacy. Go back to what you were just saying, going, is this me? Like
Yeah.
what did I
Yeah.
do?
Yeah.
And not be able to heal that or bring it closer together, because the emotional intimacy pillars got cracks in it.
Do you guys still work with couples? You
Oh,
take
yeah.
on clients, coaching clients? Oh,
She
fantastic.
does.
I do all the coaching.
Okay,
Elisa,
wonderful.
We learned years ago, many couples wanted to do 2-on-2. And we learned many years ago that I'm not great in that moment. And Elisa just has such a
Oh.
voice and a prophetic voice to speak into their lives.
Mhm.
So we just said, you know what, it's actually better for you as a couple to not have so much going on. You just need to hear from her and let her speak into your life. And then you guys can process it and come out with an action plan.
Yeah.
But you do your podcast together.
We
Absolutely.
do the podcast together. Yes.
And I think
Yeah.
that's huge, because you get both perspectives.
Yes. Yep.
we,
Yep.
we have since the very beginning. And that actually just, in terms of couples developing emotional intimacy, because we've talked on so many different topics over the last 12 years, the show really has become that resource for either a husband or a wife to just listen in. And I've got clients, they actually listen every Wednesday. The show comes out on Tuesday. On Wednesday nights, they have dinner together and they listen, and it becomes that jumping off point, because so many people have told us over the years, oh, if you and Tony can talk about it, then I can come back and be like, so I was listening to the podcast and Tony said, or
Yeah.
said, and now it's
That's
not
a conversation starter.
right now. It's
That's
not
it.
like, oh, I want to talk about this. It's like, so that thing that Tony said, can we talk about that? And it becomes a much softer introduction than can we talk?
Well, we're talking to podcast listeners. Obviously, some people are watching this on YouTube, but we will put a link to your podcast, One Extraordinary Marriage. Is that what it's called? One Extraordinary Marriage?
One Extraordinary Marriage Show.
Yes. And we'll put a link to that in our show notes. But, and of course, your book. But where else can people connect with you?
Best place, oneextraordinarymarriage.com. Just come on over. You'll see
Love it.
everything we have going on there.
Well, thank you for what you do. Thank you for helping couples learn these incredibly valuable skills. I hope that this gave people hope.
Yes.
Right? I hope that they understand, like, if it's a skill, which means it's not something you're born with. It means we all have the ability to improve it.
100%. I love the way you put that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chalene.
You guys are awesome. We'll see you soon.
Definitely.